Welcome everyone to this webinar on consultancy from myself, Martin Parr, and Jim Scholes. This is part of the Operational Research Society's Problem Structuring Methods Special Interest Group. Okay, so an outline of what we're going to cover today is the aim and context of consulting, the nature of consulting, the diagnostic design elements, and then the service delivery. And ultimately, we're going to be distilling some lessons about what it's like to practice as a consultant in a number of different areas. So as you'll see in a few slides' time, Jim and I have slightly different sort of background and a different experience, but we can provide you with an overview of the different roles of consulting. Our aims are to give that overview, to look at examples of the types of consulting work that we've been involved in, and to outline some of the approaches that have been taken, and then ultimately to have an interactive question and answer session where you'll be invited to type in your questions. Feel free as you go through to enter questions, and we can take those sort of as we go. So, but in terms of who we are, my background is as a sort of management consultant. I've had about 15 years of consulting in central government, primarily in the Ministry of Defence. I've also worked for the Department for Education for a bit and the Cabinet Office on various secondments. My academic background is I'm an honorary professor at the University of Kent in the business school. I supervise one of the PhDs there and then regularly lecture at Kent on the MBA programme and others. I also lecture at the Defence Academy on the Intermediate Command course. So they're one of the sort of basic courses that the staff do on promotion. It's essentially one of the foundation courses that leads through as people are promoted up to various officer grades. So Jim.
Thanks, Martin. In some ways, the experience we have is complementary and slightly overlapping here and there. My management experience is in both public and private sectors. I've worked in UK central government and then in the computer industry for a time. But for this particular webinar, I think it's probably my 30 years plus experience in management consulting that's most relevant. I've worked with large multinationals internationally. The focus has always been on growth and strategy, organizational capabilities, and leadership and change. Like Martin, I have an academic background as an honorary professor at Lancaster University Management School, where I've contributed for over 20 years. And I've spoken and lectured at several institutions in many countries around the world. I've published on systems, strategy, and leadership. The combined consulting experience that Martin and I bring today covers both public services and commercial enterprises, and operating as an internal consultant contrasted with operating as an external consultant. This graphic's a little bit crude because I think the truth is we've all, between Martin and myself, strayed into the four boxes here, but it gives a sense of where we're starting from in sharing our experience. Martin, shall I cover this one? One of the things that Martin and I talked about before preparing materials for this was what's really meant by consulting. And I think that what we recognize from conversations we've had with many people is that not everybody means the same thing by consultancy. And it's not surprising. Roles can range from advisory to providing temporary resources, from sole practitioners through to firms that now have over 300,000 employees, and fees that range from, let's say, £50 an hour to several £1,000 per hour. We've looked across a number of sources, and I think this summary from consultancy.uk is quite useful because it gives some sense of the main segments in consulting and consulting services. So we're not going to run through all of this. This just gives you a little bit of context. I think what you take out of today probably depends on what particular perspective you have on consultancy. And hopefully we can pick up on some of that in the question and answer. Martin.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Jim. So looking then at sort of internal consulting in the public services, I think this has been predominantly where I've had sort of the majority of my experience. I have done all the things where I've been seconded, strangely enough, to as a sort of external to the public service sort of system, leading essentially as a civil servant, leading a team of industry professionals. Quite sort of an interesting position to be put into, where you're sort of the one who essentially has to abide by the rules of sort of the public service, and you know, it's sort of an interesting kind of a reining in of sometimes of different behaviours there. So yeah, very sort of, I think we've got good spread across this space essentially. So then moving on to what is really, I think, the essence of consulting. So this graphic sort of attempts to really illustrate the position that sort of many people are in. I think if you're a sort of data analyst, or if you've been used to making decisions based on immense amounts of rationality, you would probably sort of leave university kind of, you know, knowing how to make sort of, you know, how to use data well, how to use information well, how to make good, rational, solid decisions. And certainly my experience then was that I was gradually ever more absorbed into this sort of political, emotional and rational sort of space, where you find yourself being the person who's kind of lobbying for common sense, lobbying for making sure that public money is spent well, that we do a good job for the public purse. But also in the background, there's a whole lot of baggage that, you know, people have their own favourite ways of doing things, they have their own preferred activities, and ultimately there's always that sort of political, you know, debate. So one of the examples that I give a lot is if you could make a very, very rational case to, for example, manufacture the maritime hulls abroad, so the sort of hull for a ship. And it would be based on an immense amount of rationality about, you know, the sort of you know, saving you could make in labour costs by manufacturing abroad. But it wouldn't fly politically, and it wouldn't fly emotionally. It would go in the face of all of the defence planning that we have, and you know, at the end of the day, this is about British jobs as well. So as much as you could do a very rational job of analysing, you know, how you could save money in shipbuilding, it's something that just isn't going to politically fly. So you just might as well not go there. So there's that huge, great big space in decision making, which sort of works its way down from some immensely rational decisions about very much common sense administering of government policy, etc., through to the hugely emotional political decisions around things like Brexit, where you know, debates about rationality don't really stack up. This is about a political imperative and a mission. So that's the kind of space that we very much work in as consultants. And there are a whole lot of forces at work. The force that, you know, I try to encourage people to adopt sort of across government is one of sort of evidence-based decision making. So taking a clear and solid, rigorous case, and using, you know, an immense amount of evidence in preparing that case, understanding where the strengths and weaknesses of it are, and then letting those flow through into the risk management. So understanding, well, actually we haven't had time to get our arms around X. It's not the highest priority thing, but on the other hand, it does feature. So that's a risk. That's something that we need to manage as we go forward. And we can then make sort of an educated decision about, do we postpone a decision, spend more time looking around X and dealing with the problems of it, or do you say, actually, it's a second order priority, it's not going to matter too much one way or the other, and we'll just carry on and do what we do. There's then the other opposing force, which is sort of policy-based evidence making. So there are sort of, you know, certainly situations in which you know, people have found themselves in a position where they've been told, you know, we need to buy X. How do you do that? And well, the answer is no, you don't really want to go in and look for buying X. You want to solve a problem, and solving the problem can have, you know, many, many options for how you deliver that. And so ultimately you want to turn it back to, you know, evidence. What's the evidence telling us? And I think, thankfully, always through my career, I've been able to do that. It's sometimes an interesting journey. You're sometimes, met with some sort of interesting politics. But I think all the time, I've always been able to go back to, okay, so what can we find out from the evidence base? What's the evidence base telling us here? And how do we then move forward based on a sure footing? Because you may achieve the political imperative to buy X might actually be a very, very rational and very sensible thing to do. All you've got to do is go and look at, honestly, what does the evidence tell you? And then, where do you head from that? If it doesn't head towards the political area, well, that's not the end of the world. So then, in terms of what kind of skills are needed, I thought it was worth really unpacking what are the set of skills that are needed to be a consultant. And I think working sort of through what it takes to consult. So you would start with sort of finding, a decision maker who's got a problem. So you need to spend some time with potential clients and then work with them on sort of the problem that's critical. Can't be something that is sort of second rate to the organisation. It's got to be something that's really important, really burning hot, and is worth putting some resource into. And then the next stage is about really quickly gathering enough information to understand, is it feasible? There are an enormous number of problems out there, certainly in government, that are really, really difficult to solve. And they may be solvable with oodles of effort and resource and time and all the other things that you haven't got. But given a realistic amount of resource and a realistic amount of effort, is it actually possible to get there? What does that journey look like? And in doing so, you've got to put in a fair bit of, a fair few assumptions about, how realistic and sensible is that sort of plan as you work forward? How strong is it? How defensible is it? When someone comes along and says, what's the evidence for this? Well, what is the evidence base for it? What are we going to stand on, and what are we ultimately going to make a decision based on? Then it's around writing a contract. So even within government, we often find ourselves having to write something that's akin to a contract, even if it isn't necessarily a formal contract, that really says we will do this, we will deliver something, and it's fair for both parties involved. Then after that, there comes the challenge of, well, you've sort of got yourself on board. You've committed yourself to solving the problem, and then the scary roller coaster ride begins, because you've got then to rapidly draw together all the information, all the data, and all the evidence. And of course, you'll always find it's not in the format you expected it in. It takes ages to gather it, and it's not in any way, shape, or form, machine readable or anything else. So you've got to put some more people on it, etc. So all the realities of digging into the the information system, etc., come to hit you. And then ultimately, once you've done that digging, you've got to then make sense of it and understand, where the challenges might be. What's the essence of this thing? What's it really struggling with? And then finally, you've got to draw it together as a clear story. So that you'll be, mining perhaps, gigabytes, terabytes of information, and you've got to pull out of that, what's the headline message? What's the elevator pitch? If I've only got 1 minute with the seniors, what is it I would tell them if I only have 1 minute? And then you've got to work closely with the stakeholders to look at sort of possible solutions. So I think the folk who've not been involved as consultants, some of my students, when I've presented sort of some of the work that I've done, have kind of often looked at it and said, yeah, we could have told you that before you started. And this is very true. There are a lot of times where there's a few solutions that people could just have come up with. But without going through that sort of journey, without taking the stakeholders with you, without that evidence base, it's really difficult to do anything other than just be a political lobbyist, hoping for the best. Certainly the journey that I've always taken our stakeholders on is, how do you provide a decent, solid evidence base that allows us to take a step forward very clearly and very sort of carefully. And it's then a case of working through the set of solutions, looking at the impact of those, recommending a solution ultimately, and getting the client on board. And that's, again, no easy thing. There's often a number of clients, and I've begun quite a number of consultancy exercises across government with generally 3, 4, 5, 10 sometimes people who all see themselves as the owner of this thing. And you have to kind of work a very interesting journey. I mean, it's quite interesting, and you can almost write a novel based on some of those journeys, because quite a number of people come in pulling in totally different directions, And then you've got to just find the common ground and work out, well, is the common ground here? Is it worth taking this forward? Is there something that you want to do? And ultimately, you've got to then sort of have a client recommend your services at the end. So you've got to come out of all of that looking sort of, still as good as you went into it. and that's quite hard. It's a tough journey, and there's some real people skills needed here. So that's the other sort of half of the graphic that I put together. That essentially, this stands on an analytical foundation. So of course, analytical skills are necessary. Analytical thinking, being able to essentially apply sort of holistic thinking to the problem. These are all massively essential analytical sort of tools that you just have to be able to wield. But on top of that, there's an array of people skills that are always needed in these roles. There's a whole set of sort of things that you have to do. So from maintaining a good network of clients through to sort of be a calm force for good. I've seen people do that just amazingly well. I think at the beginning of my career, I can imagine myself sort of feeling quite agitated with some of the behaviours that I've experienced. But actually, as I've gone on, I've sort of started to adopt that kind of calm, sort of force for good approach, and that does actually help you enormously in building rapport and maintaining that rapport, keeping people on side. They may not like the message, but at least if they understand where it's coming from, why you're heading that way, that you've got the best interest of the project at heart, that goes a long way towards encouraging people to maybe move from their current position. And sharing things is also kind of important. I've had to do that so many times as a consultant, to draw a group of people together, to take in input from the room, from different people, to sort of try and encourage the louder people to be a bit quieter and encourage the quiet people to speak up a bit, and sometimes to manage some very, very nasty sort of encounters. And that is all just part of the stock and trade. That's just what you really have to do. And ultimately then presenting complex information. And the better you are, I think, at presenting complexity in really straightforward layman's terms, the easier that life is, and the more that people can understand what you're doing. Because often you find yourself at the interface between something that's sort of deeply technical, deeply sort of embedded in sort of an organisation, and the decision makers who haven't got the capacity to begin to entertain the breadth of that problem. So you have to try and sort of break it down. And I remember one particular review many years ago, which was a national review of a really key capability. And I thought we'd achieved a triumph. We had a 6x6 matrix, which showed the whole state of the national capability. And I went and presented this to the decision makers, and I was just glowing with pride, thinking, wow, we've got it down to a 6x6 matrix. And it certainly wasn't all my idea. And do you know what they said to me? They said, can't you make it simpler? I said, well, I can make it traffic light if you like. It's red, but I'm not sure that helps you. So yeah, there's that sort of simplification to the simplest point possible, but no simpler. So yeah, that's a kind of a quick counter through of certainly my experience of that sort of set of skills and how important those people skills are in consultancy. So what we often find ourselves having to do is lead our stakeholders on a journey. So problems very rarely come in perfectly formed. They very rarely arrive as a sort of, here's something that you just need to feed into sort of some well-known model, and the output will pop out. Often what comes along is a sort of an itch of some sort. There's a problem with something. I remember, a while back, there was a big sort of government department that said to me, we've got a problem with this, we can solve it easily, but we can't get it past commercial. And actually the process of looking at, what they were trying to do and why they were trying to get this past commercial led to a completely different sort of rethink of the organisation. And in fact, it wasn't a problem at all with, the part of the organisation they thought it was. It was just a problem with an approach. And so, of course, what you first find is when you've done your digging, when you have sort of delved into the breadth of a problem, the first thing you're often greeted with is shock and denial. And this graph, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's graph, came originally from people who had a terminal diagnosis. So these were the kind of stages that people went through, initially sort of denying, then in anger, bargaining, depression, and then ultimately acceptance. The change management gurus took hold of this probably about sort of 20 or 30 years ago. And they've been sort of using it quite widely because it seems to represent pretty well the stages people go through when they find they've got to change. And I think if you think back to, when you've had a big change, when you've maybe had to move office, or you've had to, sort of change from a job you liked for personal reasons or something, and we all tend to sort of go through those stages. And it's not necessarily a linear thing. You don't necessarily go from one to the other. You can sometimes be in acceptance one day and then back to shock and denial the next. But these stages are kind of useful in change management in the sense that they kind of signpost you where to go. So of course you're first going to get shock and denial, and then the likelihood is that your client is going to become angry at some point, potentially angry with you, or angry with your analysis, or angry with the entire project, or angry with the world at large. But there will be some anger at some point. And a good way past that is to kind of keep leading them on towards, okay, so what does this look like when it's finished? How are you going to feel when it's finished? What would be great for you? What would be the sort of the legacy that you can leave, maybe? What would be the sort of the thing that you would want to stamp your mark on when we've got there? And the more you can kind of help to encourage them to go through these stages, the easier life is going to be. So people struggle sometimes. They remain in one stage. It's very, very difficult to move them on. But I think you can often find, particularly one-to-one, but sometimes you can do it with groups as well, there may be a uniting thing. It may be that that group is really committed to, I don't know, to a particular cause or to a particular thing, and actually they're prepared to unite behind that, give up something that was quite dear to them, and say, okay, look, we want to go and, I don't know, save the whale or something, whatever it happens to be that's really important to them, and therefore they'll go through these stages and they'll say, okay, well, we'll give up what we wanted in order to get something that's bigger and more important to us. And this is just really a note to sort of say, if you're finding your stakeholders are angry and they're bargaining with you and they've hit sort of depression, etc., don't be surprised. This is just normal. This is part of everyday sort of work for a consultant, really. Okay, so healthy signs. What I've tried to capture here is what you might see if a project is sort of on track, is doing really well, and you're likely to be able to make a big sort of difference in this. One of the healthy signs, certainly in government, is you're among the first consultants to work on this. When you're the 5th, the 10th, or the 100th, and everybody else was a really, really bad consultant, and so they've brought you in, I would start to worry, because I don't think there's that many bad consultants in the world, and I suspect they're probably going to tell the stakeholders the same thing that you're going to tell them, and so that could be a bit of a problem for you. The next one is that the problem's really seriously impacting on something. Once in a while, things have gone awry when something's been a kind of nice to have, or it's been a bee in the bonnet of one of the senior managers, but actually you've not got the whole board to go and put their weight behind it. You've not got necessarily the commitment from everyone involved. There's real pressure and real interest in solving it, not hunting for someone to blame, and that's absolutely key. John Kotter, in his sort of stages of change, talks about the burning platform. He says that you can't get a change through an organisation where people are really comfortable, really happy, the status quo is absolutely fine, no reason to move on. Why would anybody ever want to change? And he's completely right. So there has to be a good reason. And as a consultant, you're not really in a position to sort of kind of light the fire under people. So that has to be done. That has to be, if a senior manager wants it done, there's no obvious reason why it has to be done. Then the senior manager has to be the one saying, look, you've got to do this. This is really massively important. There's no choice. You've got to do it. And so the pressure can't come just from the consultant. There must be power within the organisation. And then again, the healthy signs are around the contract being written around achieving one thing. If the contract's written around a million different things, you're probably not going to achieve them, not to anyone's satisfaction. But if they want one thing out of you, and that one thing really matters above everything else, again, that's a really healthy sign that that one thing is really important. If you can get your arms around it, you can do it. You're going to keep your stakeholders sort of happy. Looking then at the sort of the warning signs, if no one actually owns the problem, you kind of pass from one person to another to get a description of it. There's, the sort of the chief maybe will tell you, oh yeah, well, it's important to me to achieve X, but the following people will tell you all about X. That doesn't sound like something that's really, really bothering the chief to me. Does it really need changing? If the work's predicated on a dream, I don't know, there was one particular piece of consultancy where as a peripheral exercise, we were asked to help sort of formulate how people were approaching different elements of their work. So this was a bit of sort of tutoring, coaching, etc., on soft analysis. And one person kind of came to me in that particular department, and they were looking at sort of closer working between two elements of the department. And then written on the tin was, while the heads remain separate. And we sort of had, my colleague and I had quite a wide smile as that came up. And then we sort of worked through with the lady whose problem it was to solve that. And we said, well, look, do you think it's really possible to have, you know, closer working and still remain separate? It doesn't seem to me as though, you know, you're getting the governance right of these two elements. If you're actually going to kind of separate the top, but you want to unite the bottom, don't see it happening. So again, you know, is it predicated on something that's realistic and sensible? When you're entering essentially a political battle and there's really no firm evidence that you can put together one way or the other, that's going to be pretty tough. So you know, we all know about sort of things that are massively political and quite difficult to find evidence for. And you know, the Brexit situation would be one. Elements of the Brexit situation, of course, you can find evidence for. You can find evidence to support, you know, if we went to World Trade Organization terms, what are the likely cues of support? That's something that you could build a model around. But actually, you know, should we exit or shouldn't we, as we were looking at in the past? What sort of terms should be in the agreement that's going to be negotiated over the next sort of months? Well, that's pretty tough. That's you know, elements of it are really amenable to sort of an evidence-based approach. But if you're wading into this, you know, complete battle, as you may, in organisations around, you know, we want Division A based in one place and another group want Division A based in another place, that's going to be pretty hard. If there's a real blame culture within the organisation, if you're essentially scapegoat hunting, that's another tough one to be involved in, because people will see you as sort of someone that they won't be open with. And you know, you've got to really deal with that head on. You've got to go in with a clear remit and a sort of view that actually you're here to help and get people on board. So again, it's a warning sign. It doesn't mean that, you know, it's something you shouldn't do. If you've got a million loopholes in the contract, well, that says, you know, again, they're not that serious about really going for it. And when the solution's already been decided, I mean, very much that sort of policy-based evidence-making piece, if you just have to make a case for it, that's pretty hard. I mean, we've all been asked to do those sorts of things, but in the end, often a conversation can be steered around, you know, what is it that you really want? What does good really look like? And once you've got that, then it's a little easier to sort of get down to, okay, so maybe there's some analytical work that can be done ahead of a political decision, perhaps. So yeah, that's just ways of finding things that may cause some issues for you. Okay, Jim.
Thanks, Martin. Let's go back to this little graphic. I just want to be really explicit. Whilst what Martin has talked through from his experience has been primarily driven from a perspective of public services and internal consulting, what I'm now going to talk about is based on commercial experience in a commercial environment, working on strategy, representing a boutique consultancy focused on growth and working in large companies. So I certainly recognize many of the dynamics that Martin has outlined, but the context tends to be different, and the way that the issues emerge tends to be a little bit different. What I've tried to do is to sort of simplify the approach that is typically taken for client project interventions. And we need to be explicit in a commercial context. We need to be explicit with the approach that we're taking. I've boiled it down to 3 main stages. I can certainly deliver something with many more stages, but I think these are the 3 that probably matter for the purpose of this conversation. And they're very similar in principle to what Martin's been talking about. The 3 stages that I'll talk through are about preparation, the importance of preparation in terms of diagnosing the problem or the problem situation to be dealt with, and designing an approach to dealing with it. I'm going to talk, I think, at least as much about the process of intervention and managing the intervention as dealing with a problem. I'll talk about service delivery And I'll focus pretty much, as it says here, on the idea of outcomes, what should happen as a result of this service being delivered, and outputs, what's needed by way of, for example, a report or an analysis. And finally, talk about distilling lessons from all of this, both for the client and the consultant. The preparatory diagnostic and design phase is absolutely essential in commercial consulting. Whereas I think sometimes as an internal consultant, you may feel you don't really have the authority you need to challenge the terms of reference. In a commercial environment, you at least have to be able to have a serious conversation about whether the terms of reference are right or whether they need to be re-expressed. Because once a contract is signed, there's a clear expectation that the consultant is going to deliver precisely to that contract. And if the description of the problem or the problem situation is a little bit weak, if it's ambiguous, if the client isn't totally clear about what they're hoping to get as a result of this work and what good looks like, then you're almost doomed at the start. In some sense, this diagnostic and design phase is critical to the whole idea of problem structuring. So if we're talking about problem structuring methods, what's done at this stage and the quality of the diagnostic and the quality of the design conversation with the client is what pretty much determines the nature of the problem to be solved and the mode in which the consultant can work with the client. So I've tried to boil this down into a sort of few hopefully useful headers, and I think a good starting place for the conversation is always around what should happen as a result of this intervention. Not just what would a good plan look like, but what should actually happen as a result of this intervention. How would the client know whether or not the consultant had done a good job? Would there be some particular results achieved? Would there be evidence of certain actions being taken? And that is a tricky conversation to have. But and in some ways, it's not totally funded by the client paying for the work to be done. But this is what sets the parameters for the work. And out of that, of course, you can then have a conversation about how many need to be involved. How big is the consulting team? How many participants will there be on the client side? Will the chief executive, for example, be involved? Will the board be involved? Will functional heads be involved? And what's the project structure and linkages? Martin touched on chairing certain meetings. What kind of working groups or steering committee might need to be set up? And the importance of this is not simply keeping track of progress. It's actually about helping the client internalize the results as they emerge from doing the work. Is there need for access to external resources or experts? I think one of the things I have observed is that sometimes clients have unrealistic expectations of what the consultants know how to do, and sometimes consultants have unrealistic expectations or feel embarrassed about telling a client what they don't know how to do. So I think there is a degree of clarity needed, and I think it's really important as a consultant, you know what you're not good at, but you know, hopefully, where you can access relevant expertise if it's not within the starting team. Linkages to other initiatives have often been in situations, and I know this is also true within government and with internal consulting, where we're working on something that might be one of several initiatives going on in a relatively short period of time. And it's important, I think, in that kind of context, to be very clear about what are the other important initiatives and whether there needs to be some level of explicit linkage between them. Otherwise, the client ends up with bombarded with results that they can't really act on. Technology needs. Is there a technology infrastructure or platform needs to be built specifically for this intervention, for this project, to help people communicate? Particularly important, I think, in large global companies, people working in different time zones and so forth. Related to that, what are the communication requirements? How often do you meet with the sponsor of this work? How often do various working groups need to be consulted or involved? How often will the steering committee meet, and so forth? And how will the work be integrated into the organization as the project's concluded? So if we look back to the first bullet point on this, what should happen as a result of this intervention, actually there's a degree of responsibility being taken at the outset for something being done at the end. So there needs to be not only a plan for doing the work, but some sense of how the work itself and the results of the work can be taken forward into the organization. Now, this picture is specific, of course, to the experience base from which I'm talking, but my hunch is that there's a rough equivalent. There are certain principles in here where there may be an equivalence whether you're operating as an internal or an external consultant, whether you're working on strategy or more operational matters. Firstly, I guess I'm re-emphasizing, in my experience, the importance of understanding outputs and outcomes. And the richer discussion with the client is always about outcomes. Truth be told, nobody really wants to pay for a report. But actually, people are generally willing to pay if they will see some worthwhile change, in their view, worthwhile change actually happening. And the report may be an important part of achieving that, but it's not the whole thing. And really what this picture is also trying to say is that, at least in the world of growth strategy consulting, clients were always looking for some combination of outputs and outcomes. Strategy, for example, in terms of the analysis and the insights that can be brought. Actionable opportunities. It's all very well to have strategy, but what are we actually going to work on starting tomorrow? So some clear sense of the opportunities that will enable that strategy to be implemented. And capabilities. What new capabilities might we need for the future in order to make this strategy happen? And can we begin to develop those capabilities through doing the work, through doing the project? There are some, I guess, looking back on 30 plus years of consulting, you'd probably be disappointed on this call if I hadn't thought of some possible preconditions for success. But these are actually, they're sufficiently robust, I think, that we did actually use these in contract negotiations. So you might have to adapt them to your own circumstance, but for strategy, for growth strategy, it was always important that the CEO was actively involved and sponsoring the work rather than simply reviewing it. You don't take a strategy to the CEO. The CEO has responsibility for the strategy. So the real question needs to be, how do you work together to create something that's actionable? Top management involved and committed to action. How do you know they're committed? Everybody says they're committed, but how do you know? Well, you start to get a sense of it when they devote the personal time that's required, because they're all pretty busy, but are they actually going to reallocate some of their time in order to support this work? Are they going to allocate some resources to doing this work? Are they going to make decisions, real decisions, when they need to be made? Team members, I should say, in the kind of consulting I've done, we've always worked with people in the organization. We've not simply delivered a report to the organization. We've used the resources that the organization has available to help get the work done, because that helps the organization internalize the understanding of the results. They're not simply looking at a report, they've helped to create the report. And the team members you look for are those that the organization can't do without. It's important not to just in effect take whoever's available on the day. There's a serious conversation needed about the quality of resource that has to go into doing work on future growth strategy. Going forward plan, I mentioned earlier on, so we're looking not only at getting this thing started, but how would we ever take this forward? What will top management do when the consultant's no longer there? Do they have a clear plan? Do they have resources? Do they have the understanding to take it forward? Agreeing reasonable expectations about outcomes, especially in the early stages of the work. I think Martin touched on this in slightly different words earlier on, but it's so important to ensure that reasonable expectations are being set. And frankly, as an external consultant, if you feel that the expectations are not reasonable, you can't possibly deliver, then either you have to help reframe the thinking about the problem, perhaps into stages, or frankly, you have to walk away. And sometimes we have done that. You need to walk away. If you do need to walk away, you have to do it in a constructive fashion. You have to explain why. It's not some fit of pique. But it helps, by and large, it helps people who are serious about making change happen if you can explain what is a reasonable expectation and what is not. Communication plan, I think probably that's self-explanatory. And the consulting team's access to the organization. The consulting team in this kind of environment that I'm describing plays an important role in helping build internal organizational capabilities, in transferring know-how, in coaching and supporting people, in developing the strategy and then going on to implement it. And it's important to ensure that success criteria are established for each key stage, so that you don't get the results until the end, but we do have some confidence that we're making progress. To achieve outcomes like that, the consultant needs to work at multiple levels. I'll show you three related to each other. The most obvious, I guess, is ensuring the company's strategic context and how that's going to change and present new challenges over time. So we need to understand, where has this company been? Where do they think they're going? That historical context is really important. Secondly, understanding how the consulting practitioner's own worldview, context, and approach may be more or less relevant to the particular client over time. So, in other words, this isn't general purpose consulting where the consultant's whole objective is to create a relationship of dependency such that the client can never manage on their own. This is recognizing that different kinds of consulting can add value at different times in an organization's evolution. So you've got to be pretty clear about that. The level 3, take those two, the first two levels, and figure out what's the mode and process for the consulting intervention and how that can influence the quality of the outcomes. It's an adaptive process. For those of you who might be interested, there's an author called Ronald Heifetz who talks about adaptive leadership. I think he was at Kennedy School of Government, but well worth a look. This idea of adaptive leadership and adaptive process. So in some sense, what I'm trying to convey here is paying attention to the what of problem solving and paying attention to the how of intervening to deal with the problem. Experience has shown the need to watch out for several pitfalls on the journey. Now, to some extent, we've touched on these in preconditions, I suppose, but I won't take too long on this. What I want to emphasize is that it's an ongoing watch out. It's all very well to agree things up front, but if as the project or the intervention starts to unfold, you observe that actually leadership are pulling back. Actually, they're not supporting their people. There isn't enough motivation. There isn't a clear enough cause within the organization. Or there's a lack of responsibility. Roles are unclear. Or there's a lack of understanding. It's simply the experience base within the organization is simply very different to the future you're trying to help them create. Maybe a lack of stamina, maybe several other initiatives going on around about the same time. There will be people changes. How do you deal with people changes? They can be very, very important. And in most commercial contexts, if you're running a project of, let's say, 6 months, 9 months, or even 12 months, there will be some people changes. And then what do you do if in the end you find that with the best will in the world, actually the organization does lack some key capabilities? How do you help them face up to that? How do you help them bridge that? I guess sort of final picture. So that was something about service delivery. What I'll do is just offer you this kind of framework, which I found useful. For those of you who are familiar with notions of action research, this is kind of close to some early models of action research at least, but I think the value is having a reasonably structured way of looking at each intervention and systematically teasing out some learning. So I think we need to be clear that as consultants, we are resources. The client is applying resources, and the way that resources are applied in any particular intervention may be different. So we need to be very mindful of that. What are the resources that are being applied? We need to be clear that we have our own intellectual framework or worldview, if you like, which will determine the principles by which we operate as consultants and what ideas we apply and the criteria by which we design the intervention and so forth. Modality, there are many choices as to how you can intervene in a situation. Again, we need to be pretty sensitive to it. The particular client's intervention, who's the client in this case? That's a really, really important consideration. Sometimes it might be a CEO or a head of a division, but sometimes it's somebody else. What's the purpose of the task and so forth? So the suggestion here is if we have some simple framework like this before we even start on an intervention, then as consultants, as we accumulate interventions over time, as we accumulate intervention experience, we can start to use each intervention to add to our learning, and that can help build our own tool set and capabilities. So that's the kind of reflection, if you like, or the picture that's offered here. So I hope that makes some sense. We've been through it pretty quickly, but I think we probably ought to move to Q&A now.
Thanks, Jim. Okay, I'm just going to bring in Christina Phillips, who is co-chair of the Problem Structuring Methods Special Interest Group. Hopefully she's now.
I'm here.
Perfect.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, perfectly. The wonders of technology. Yeah, thanks for joining.
Great. Well, actually, I have a question here about that. But first of all, I'm going to ask you a question which was asked while you were talking earlier on, Martin. Roger James asked you, you said itch of some sort. Can you expand? In my experience, often people have adopted a set course. Are there approaches to move them from this false certainty?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good question. Yeah, thanks, Roger. So the itch of some sort, it's a sort of general term we use for someone having a kind of requirement that they think needs to be met. But yeah, you're absolutely right. The number of times that people come to me and say, okay, right, all we need to do is whatever it is. And you kind of start to unpack that with, well, why do you need to do that? What's really important for you about doing that? What will it do for you if that thing is achieved? And then you get into, so what would you like me to do? What's the ideal? Sometimes I use the sort of magic wand scenario of, if I could give you a magic wand, what would happen? What would change? What would be the difference? What would you expect to see? And they will still come to you, sometimes at least, with, well, all you need to do is build a something or other. I need to get from here to there, and all I need is a car. And that isn't necessarily the only way of doing it. So then there's a sort of education job around, well, we can do this, of course, in a whole variety of different ways. Why are you sure X is the right thing to do? And they'll always come back with, well, it's always worked before, or of course everybody knows. What we can do is we could just go and check that out. Should we just do a bit of checking and just make absolutely sure that that's the right thing to do? And the chances are, when you've done a bit of checking, you'll find, well, actually, it may not be. So then you're on that sort of change curve of, they're going to say, that's what rubbish. No, we've always done it that way. And then you've got to kind of go through, well, actually, no, there is some fundamental basis behind this. So yeah, it's a very good question. People do come with a very, very clear approach sometimes. all you've got to do is X. And it's just that sort of, leading through that change journey. And I've not come across anybody in all the time that I've worked on consultancy projects that's ever been totally immovable. I mean, I've had some people who were nearly immovable, but I've never had somebody who was actually totally immovable. And that includes some pretty tough service people. They're on the fast track to their career, and they've been used to issuing orders, and everybody said yes, sir. Well, and this is sort of interesting. It's a bit like Yes Minister. That you can say Yes Minister, but there's a whole variety of yeses. Perfect. Okay.
Lovely. Thank you, Martin. So we've got another one here, which is a lovely question, and very much chimes in with what you were saying before about the wonders of technology. From Tony Hines, in your experiences, how do you think the consultancy process has changed as a result of changing technologies in recent times?
Jim, do you want to give that one a go?
Well, the question is brilliant. It's so good that it's quite hard to answer. I mean, there are some obvious impacts that we can see, I guess, but they are rather basic. For example, use of Skype versus travel. I mean, my own consulting career goes back an awful long way, and I used to spend a lot of time on airplanes just trying to get to meetings, and nowadays you wouldn't even dream of doing it. So we can use technology in this way. Internal, in effect, blogs on a project you see of. So it's all the technology we would use as individuals now you find being used in a corporate or project context. In terms of, for example, report production or materials production or research during the course of a project with large global firms, they will literally have people working 24 hours in effect on some of the materials or the analysis, because they're able to share across time zones and can get a remarkable amount of material processed in very short time. Also, and again, this is a fairly mundane use, but it can be quite powerful. The ability to connect the sponsor, let's say it's the chief executive, to people who are doing the work through simply projecting, creating a video call. It can be quite powerful and strongly motivating, because you can connect the sponsor with folks who are out in the field in some remote place working on the project. And to do that periodically has a really big impact. So I guess fairly mundane examples that I've given, but by and large they improve efficiency and impact. But in the end, I think, at least in my own context, you can't do it all remotely. You could work better with teams when you spent time face to face with them, but we haven't yet reached a point where the technology completely replaces the face to face.
Thank you for that answer, Jim. That's really insightful. So it could almost get in the way if people thought they could do everything remotely. So I've got one here from Tom Bueller. How do you deal with weak evidence for introducing interventions? Can the customer still be bought in, even if more professional judgment being used?
So is that one for me, Christina? Shall I have a go?
I think that's for either of you, really. I mean, it chimes with what Martin was saying about you do actually need to have.
I can also answer this from personal experience.
Right. Okay. Great.
Answering it from personal experience, I will be honest. We have walked away on more than one occasion where we just didn't think that the customer had realistic expectations against which we could deliver, and we try to do it in a constructive way, And I'll give you a for example without naming names, but we had an opportunity to work with a very large, very well-known, branded consumer goods company that looked super attractive to a small consultancy starting up as we were. However, when we got close to them, we found out that this was one of many initiatives they had running. And honestly, we didn't think we could add a lot of value. And we thought it was not going to be a great reference for us, that they would end up being disappointed. And essentially what we did was we said, we don't think we can help you on this in this way. Here are the reasons why. And what we would strongly urge you to do is to sequence the priorities of the projects you've got running now. You don't need something from us. And that's probably an extreme example, but I think you have to be prepared to have that kind of dialogue. And I do think that can be a very tricky dialogue to have as an internal consultant, where I think it's sometimes taken as given that you're there to pick up whatever's given to you. I've done a little bit of internal consulting many years ago in government, and I do remember occasionally feeling that way. Martin,
yeah, I think there is that sort of, you know, something you're kind of expected to do almost if you're there. I think if I were presented with something where there was extremely weak evidence and we were charging towards making maybe a really big decision, I think what I would be starting to look at is, okay, well, what risks are we taking? Where are the holes in the evidence? And what are the unknowns here? So if the unknowns are relatively peripheral, if the unknowns are things that you can deal with, you know, after you've made the big decision, but you can decide on, I don't know, a route for something that's one of the big unknowns, and you've got lots of options, and it's all going to be, you know, relatively manageable. I would be starting to say, well, okay, yes, you can probably proceed, but actually, isn't it worth cooking up a plan to go and shore this up before you go? If what I was presented with was really, we're going to go in and make, you know, a big decision, and actually we don't have much of an evidence base behind it at all, I will be starting to look at, okay, so what risk are you really running here? If it's kind of project catastrophe, if you don't kind of get that evidence that you need, then it's really about the seniors making a decision back into that political and emotional space. As consultants, you can't sort of, you know, you can't make customers' decisions for them. So you have to allow them that space, but you can also champion the sort of, look, there's things we can do here. There's some work that can be done. You know, we need a bit of extra time. We need a bit of extra money. But in the grand scheme of things, it's probably not very much time. It's probably not very much money, and you can actually shore up that decision. I have been in that position once where I've had to pretty much say, okay, there's a whole lot of risk that you're running right now, and you're charging towards making a decision. Is that really the most sensible thing to do? And eventually I got a change of course, and it wasn't really delaying anything at all. It was all about sort of just things going into a system. It was all just about the bureaucracy almost setting the timescale. And all we had to do was just readjust the timescale a little bit, and you could just shave off massive amounts of risk from the activity. And I just kind of banged on for a lot about, well, it's a real no-brainer to do it, isn't it? And eventually people said, yeah, it's a real no-brainer to do it.
You just keep saying it long enough. It's like good propaganda, yeah?
Absolutely. Drip, drip.
Yeah. Yeah. So that feeds in very nicely to this last question I've got here at the moment, unless anybody else wants to put one in for the last call. James Trippett has asked, what are the advantages of working as a consultant in the ways that you have talked about, rather than aiming to work in a similar way or towards similar aims from within organisations, particularly public service, personally and in terms of the outcomes of the interventions?
Ooh, okay. So the advantages, I think there's a few of them. For me, it's enabled me to move around a whole lot. It's enabled me to go and explore government departments that actually I would in no way have managed to get access to if I was in a traditional kind of hierarchy. I mean, yes, you can move around, of course, in that traditional hierarchy, but once you've moved, you're there. You know, you can move from Department A to Department B, but if you don't like Department B, it's kind of difficult to get back to A. So I've enjoyed enormous flexibility in being able to go out and look at what's going on, look at the different ways that organisations, sort of government works in the different departments. And I've been able to take a whole lot of what I've learned from each department across to, the other department. It's been also quite a really sort of good balance of work and life for me. I find myself often in a situation where, yes, I'm really busy from time to time, but then I can also program in sort of relatively, I wouldn't say quiet, but times when I'm writing up things, times when I'm reviewing, times when I'm looking at data and looking at what we do. And that actually makes for being able to finish at 5 o'clock, being able to be with the family, being able to sort of see my children in the evenings. And for me, it's a huge work-life balance thing as well, that actually I can do that. It's great, So I found it immensely interesting, immensely empowering. And actually, I've been into meetings that there's no way I would get into them. I mean, you could sell tickets to some of those meetings. They were that much fun. They were that interesting, and actually, you get to see a whole lot of what's going on in the world. So I would say that was just a massive. So I can't really see many negatives to it. There's a whole lot of positives for what I've done, certainly. What do you think, Jim? What's been your...
Yeah, I mean, I very much concur with the kind of experiences you've described. I don't think you do consulting work unless you enjoy it. And I've been very, very lucky to get involved in a wide range of organizations and challenges and so forth as a consultant. And I've got this kind of curiosity, which is why I put this picture back up. I like to work around in this kind of circle. I like to think about the problem of intervention. And I think, it's been, for me, a great learning opportunity. And I get a lot out of that. I also think there's a surprising amount of transferability in lessons that are learned, for example, in the traditional industry sector like oil and gas, and looking at surprisingly similar challenges in consumer goods or in technology companies. So what you find is that very often the lessons are transferable across sectors, and I find that quite fascinating. So I've thoroughly enjoyed it, and it's an opportunity I certainly wouldn't have had sticking with any kind of line management role in industry or policy role in government.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, everyone, for the questions. I think we're just about out of time. I just want to make a bit of a plug for the next webinar that we do. So if anyone's got any particular topics, can I suggest you put them into the sort of question section now. Feel free to suggest anything that you like. If there's something that would be useful to you, we would be very happy to take that on board and see if we can find sort of appropriate people to kind of cover that subject. So we're really interested in running now a webinar, ideally every sort of few months, just to kind of keep the group together. So it's been a great pleasure. Thanks to everyone who's helped out, particularly thanks to Jim, to Christina, thanks as well to Tatty from the OR Society for putting this together. That's been absolutely brilliant.
Can I just say before we go, thank you very much to both Martin and Jim for working so hard on that presentation, which I know they have over the last couple of months. It was really informative. And to be honest with you guys, you're really selling it to me. I really fancy going off and setting up as a consultant now.
Perfect. That's great news.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
See you.
Thanks, Ray.
Bye.